The cold glass fogged up with the boy's breath. Jack, only 12 years old, pressed his face against the window of the elegant restaurant, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding inside. It wasn't hunger that kept him there, though his stomach ached. It was something more urgent, more unsettling. Le Maison glowed like a jewel on the cold night, its golden light spilling over white linen tablecloths and silver cutlery. Among the well-dressed patrons, Sarah Thompson stood out. Her jewelry sparkled as brightly as her restless eyes, while her fingers, delicate as butterfly wings, slid a crystalline vial across the mahogany table. The liquid dripped silently into Robert Thompson's wine glass, her husband engrossed in conversation with 3 other men in suits, all laughing too loudly, oblivious to the small drama unfolding before them. Sarah smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and gently pushed the glass toward her husband. Jack's heart raced. The streets had taught him how to recognize danger, to spot the shadows in people's eyes, the gestures that betrayed their true intentions. He had learned these lessons the hard way, ever since his mother abandoned him 2 years ago, leaving him at the mercy of the big city and its cruel lessons in survival. The boy watched as Robert Thompson raised the glass, his thick fingers wrapping around the delicate crystal stem. Time seemed to slow down. Jack could feel every heartbeat, every breath caught in his throat. His own brushes with death, freezing nights, gnawing hunger, constant fear, made the decision for him. His legs moved before his brain could fully process what he was doing. The restaurant's back door was ajar, a distracted waiter smoking a hurried cigarette nearby. Jack slipped inside like a shadow, his worn sneakers silent against the polished marble floor. The main dining area was a world apart from his. The heat hit him first, then the aromas, rich sauces, grilled meats, expensive perfumes. His tattered, dirty clothes clashed grotesquely with the refined atmosphere, but he kept walking. Each step brought him closer to the Thompsons' table, each second was critical. "Sir?" His voice was steadier than he expected, cutting through polite conversations and soft background music. "Don't drink that." The silence that followed was absolute. Robert Thompson slowly lowered the glass, his eyes fixed on the dirty boy who had materialized beside him. Sarah went pale, her hands trembling slightly over the linen tablecloth. "Your wife put something in your wine," Jack continued, the words spilling out quickly before his courage could falter. "I saw her through the window. She used a small crystal vial." Robert Thompson's face hardened, his eyes shifting from the glass to his wife. Sarah remained motionless, like an ice statue on the verge of shattering. In the pocket of her silk coat, the empty vial weighed heavily like a confession. Chaos rippled through the restaurant like a silent wave. Security guards emerged from the shadows, their imposing presence surrounding the table. Robert Thompson kept his eyes on his wife, who now visibly trembled, her hands clasped together as if seeking comfort. "Sarah?" Robert's voice was low, controlled, but laced with an emotion that made Jack take a step back. "Is it true?" Tears began streaming down Sarah's face, ruining her perfect makeup. Her lips quivered, but no sound came out. The vial in her pocket seemed to burn through the fine fabric of her dress, undeniable evidence. Jack watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The other restaurant patrons pretended not to look, but their furtive glances and barely contained whispers filled the air. One of the guards grabbed Jack's arm firmly but without hurting him. "You don't understand," Sarah finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "No one understands what my life has been like these past 5 years." Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Call the police," he ordered one of the guards, who immediately complied. He pulled out a cell phone. Sarah didn't resist as 2 other security guards surrounded her, her small frame seeming to shrink under the weight of her defeat. It was then that Jack noticed something strange about Sarah's behavior. While everyone expected to see panic or remorse on her face, there was something else in her eyes, a mix of relief and determination. She looked directly at Jack, and in that moment, the boy recognized something familiar in her gaze, the same fear he saw in the eyes of people who, like him, were trapped in situations they couldn't escape. "Do you want to know why, Robert?" Sarah raised her voice, surprising everyone. "Because every day by your side has been a gilded prison. Because your smiles in public hide the monster you are behind closed doors. Because..." Silence. Robert charged toward her, his face red with fury, but the security guards held him back. The businessman, always so composed, now revealed a side few had ever seen, confirming every word Sarah had spoken. Jack felt a cold knot settle in his stomach. He had seen this transformation before, respectable men who turned into monsters when confronted. His own mother had fled from such a man, leaving him behind not by choice, but out of sheer desperation. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens slicing through the night. Sarah was taken away in silence, but there was a dignity in her bearing that contradicted her situation. Robert remained in the restaurant, surrounded by people trying to calm him, his face a mask of concern that could no longer fully conceal the rage underneath. "The boy," Robert said suddenly, turning to where Jack had been standing. "Where is he?" But Jack was already gone, disappearing back into the shadows of the streets he knew so well. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that he had prevented one tragedy only to uncover another, deeper and more complex. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, alongside memories of his own mother. As he walked through the cold night, Jack knew he couldn't simply return to his old life. What he had witnessed, what he had understood, would forever alter the course of several lives, including his own. At the police station, sitting in an uncomfortable chair under fluorescent lights, Sarah stared at her hands. Detective David Miller watched her from across the table, his tired eyes revealing decades of similar stories. But there was something different about this case, something that deeply unsettled him. "Mrs. Thompson?" His voice was gentle, contradicting his stern appearance. "I need to understand why a woman of your social standing would attempt something so drastic." Sarah looked up, and for the first time since her arrival, a flicker of strength appeared in her gaze. "Have you ever lived with so much fear that even breathing hurts, detective?" Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of old pain. "Have you ever woken up every day wondering if that would be the day you couldn't take it anymore?" Outside the interrogation room, Jack sat huddled on a bench. The social worker, Karen, a kind-eyed woman with graying hair, had insisted he stay as a key witness. But the boy knew there was more to her insistence. She had recognized in him the same vulnerability she saw in Sarah. "5 years ago," Sarah continued, her hands now steady on the table, "I was a literature teacher. I loved my job, I had my own dreams. Robert came into my life like a Prince Charming, charismatic, successful, promising a fairy tale." Her voice trembled. "But fairy tales can hide nightmares." Sarah's words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. Memories of his own mother flooded his mind. The forced smiles, the hidden bruises, the endless excuses. Now he understood why she had left, leaving behind only a tear-stained note. "Forgive me, my love. Sometimes running away is the only way to survive." Karen noticed the change in the boy's expression and sat beside him. "You did something very brave today," she said softly. "But I don't think you fully understand what you prevented." In the interrogation room, Sarah unraveled a story like a ball of dark yarn: gradual isolation, financial control. Acqui esta a continuacio traducida para o Ingles. Absolute psychological violence, constant and unrelenting. The vial didn't contain poison but sleeping pills, a desperate attempt to gain a few hours of peace, to plan an escape that seemed impossible. "The boy," Sarah suddenly said, her tears finally dry. "That boy saved me twice today. Not just from my own despair, but he gave me the courage I needed." Seeing his bravery, even though he is so young and vulnerable, her voice faltered. David Miller closed his folder slowly. In his years of service, he had learned to distinguish victims from criminals, despair from malice. Sarah Thompson's case wasn't about attempted murder, it was about survival. Jack, listening through the slightly open door, felt his world shift. His actions had not only prevented a tragedy but had also given voice to someone who, like him, lived in the shadows of fear. Karen gently squeezed his shoulder, a simple gesture that carried a silent promise that things could change. The night wore on outside, but inside the station, a new story was beginning to take shape. A story about courage, about voices refusing to remain silent, and about how the most unlikely heroes often come from the most unexpected places. The next morning, the office of social worker Karen Barnes felt cozier than usual. The soft sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting golden patterns on the worn floor. Jack sat in an old armchair, his hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, a small luxury that made his eyes sparkle with distant memories of happier days. "You know, Jack," Karen began, her gentle voice breaking the comfortable silence, "there are people who go their entire lives without doing what you did yesterday. Many adults would have looked the other way." The boy lowered his eyes to his mug, watching the steam swirl in delicate spirals. I just did what felt right," he murmured. But his words carried the weight of all the times no one had done the right thing for him. Elsewhere in the same building, Sarah Thompson was meeting with her lawyer, Rachel Martinez. The morning sun illuminated the bruises on her arms, old marks she no longer needed to hide. We found records of 3 visits you made to the emergency room in the past year, Rachel said softly, flipping through a thick folder. Why didn't you report it? Sarah unconsciously touched her wrist, where an expensive bracelet hid old scars. Fear, she replied simply. And shame. How do you explain that the wife of the esteemed Robert Thompson, who smiles at charity events, is living a private nightmare? Across the city in his silent mansion, Robert Thompson stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his perfectly aligned tie, a mask of normalcy that was beginning to crack. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, concerned business partners, curious friends. His carefully constructed empire wobbled on foundations he had always known were fragile. Back in Karen's office, Jack finally found the courage to ask the question that consumed him. My mom, do you think she was scared like Mrs. Sarah? Karen felt her heart ache. In her 20 years as a social worker, she had rarely seen such understanding in someone so young. Yes, sweetheart. And sometimes when people are very scared, they make hard choices. Choices that hurt not only themselves but also the ones they love most. The words hung in the air like autumn leaves, heavy with meaning. Jack felt something warm and wet stream down his face, tears he had held back for so long. But she left me, he whispered, his voice breaking. And you saved Sarah, Karen gently replied. You turned your pain into something powerful, something that stopped someone else from being lost in the same kind of fear. In the hallway, Rachel Martinez walked briskly with a folder of documents. Years of medical records, bank statements showing suspicious transfers, threatening emails, all proof of a nightmare lived in silence. Sarah followed her, her steps steadier now, her back straighter. Carrying not only her own future but also the hope of other women trapped in gilded cages. The city continued its rhythm outside, indifferent to the dramas unfolding inside that building. But something had changed. An invisible current of understanding and healing began to flow, connecting lives that had seemed irreparably separated by fear and loneliness. The small visitation room of the youth shelter felt different that afternoon. Sarah, still wearing the elegant clothes from the night before, sat next to Jack on the worn-out sofa. Between them, a box of donuts formed an improvised bridge of trust and gratitude. You remind me so much of my younger brother, Sarah said softly, watching Jack pick out a chocolate-covered donut. He had that same look, like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders but still managed to smile. Jack bit into the donut, savoring every moment. It had been so long since anyone cared to bring him a gift or sit beside him without hurry or judgment. What happened to him? He asked, crumbs falling onto his lap. He saved me, Sarah replied, her gentle voice carrying a mix of love and sadness. He was the first to notice something was wrong with Robert. But no one believed him, they said he was just a kid. So, he ran away, promising to find help. Her hands trembled slightly. I never saw him again. Karen observed the scene from the doorway, her heart full. In her 2 decades of social work, she had rarely witnessed such a genuine connection rise from the ashes of trauma. Sarah was not just a wealthy woman fleeing an abusive marriage. She was a lost soul finding her way back through the act of caring for another. Do you want to know why I chose sleeping pills? Sarah asked, her eyes meeting Jack's. Because deep down I didn't want to hurt Robert. I just wanted enough time to escape, to start a new life. Just like your mom must have wanted. Jack felt something break inside him. Not from pain but from understanding. Years of anger and confusion were beginning to transform into something else, something closer to forgiveness. Do you think she's okay? His voice was barely a whisper. Sarah put her arm around the boy's shoulders, a gesture as natural as breathing. I'm sure she is. And even more sure that she thinks about you every day. Outside, the city maintained its frenetic pace, but inside that small room, time seemed to flow differently. Karen stepped in quietly, holding papers that could change both of their lives. Sarah, she began gently, the lawyers secured a restraining order against Robert. And there's more? She paused meaningfully. There's a temporary foster program. If you're interested, and of course if Jack agrees. The silence that followed was heavy with possibilities. Jack looked at Sarah, then at Karen, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Sarah squeezed his shoulder lightly, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. Sometimes, Sarah said softly, the family we choose is stronger than the one we're given. What do you think, Jack? At that moment, sitting on that worn-out sofa with donut crumbs on his lap and his heart full of emotions he could barely contain, Jack realized that sometimes destiny has surprising ways of healing old wounds. 3 weeks passed like pages turning gently in a new book. The small apartment Sarah rented, though modest, had large windows that let in the morning sunlight. Jack slept in the room next to hers, and sometimes in the early hours of the day she could hear his peaceful breathing, a sound that began to heal something deep inside her. The move had been quick and discreet. Rachel, the attorney, ensured that Robert would not discover the address. The white walls were still bare, but on the kitchen table, a vase of yellow daisies brought life to the space. Jack had picked them out at the corner market, their cheerful petals a stark contrast to the simplicity of the place. "My mother loved daisies," he said during breakfast, spreading butter on a piece of toast. His voice no longer carried that sharp pain when he spoke of her. "She used to say they were strong flowers, capable of growing even in the toughest places." Sarah smiled, pouring more milk into his glass. Over the past few weeks, she had learned to understand the boy's silent language. His shy smiles, his small acts of kindness, the way his eyes lit up when he felt safe. "Like you," she replied softly. The doorbell rang, making them both freeze for a moment, a reflex of the lingering fear that hadn't entirely disappeared. But it was only Karen, carrying a folder and her usual gentle smile. "I have news," Karen announced, sitting at the table with them. Jack offered her a piece of toast, a simple gesture of familiarity that brought tears to Karen's eyes. "We managed to locate your mother, Jack." Time seemed to stand still. The piece of toast in Jack's hand hovered mid-air, forgotten. Sarah instinctively held his other hand, offering silent strength. "She's okay," Karen continued, her voice soft. "She's rebuilt her life in another city. She has a stable job, has been through therapy." She paused delicately. "And she never stopped looking for you?" Tears began streaming down Jack's face, but for the first time, they weren't tears of abandonment. Sarah hugged him, feeling his small body tremble with sobs of relief. "She wants to see you," Karen said. "Whenever you're ready. No rush, no pressure." Sarah felt her heart tighten. Part of her feared losing Jack, this boy who had brought so much meaning to her life in the past weeks. But another part, the part that was learning what it truly meant to love, knew that love meant letting people find their own paths. "You don't have to decide now," Sarah whispered to Jack, still holding him close. "And no matter what you choose, you'll always have a place here." Jack pulled back slightly, looking at Sarah with eyes bright with tears. "Can I have both places?" he asked, his small voice filled with hope. "Like in those movies where families have a house by the beach and one in the city?" Sarah's laughter filled the kitchen, blending with the tears now flowing freely down her face. Karen smiled, watching how love could create new kinds of families, new ways to belong. The park was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon as Emma, Jack's mother, walked along the stone pathway. Her hesitant steps carried the weight of 2 years of absence. From a distance, she saw Sarah sitting on a bench, Jack beside her. The boy had grown, not just in height but in an inner strength that was visible even from afar. Sarah noticed the woman first and gently squeezed Jack's shoulder. "She's here," she whispered. The boy lifted his eyes from the book he was reading, his heart beating like the wings of a frightened bird. Emma stopped a few steps away. Her hair was different, shorter, and there was a new firmness in her gaze, the mark of someone who had fought to rebuild her life. "Jack," her voice trembled as she said her son's name. The boy stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the mother who had filled his dreams and nightmares for so long. Sarah remained seated, a quiet, comforting presence. "You've gotten taller," Emma said softly, tears streaming down her face. "And your eyes, they're still exactly as I remembered." Jack took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to catch the familiar scent of his mother, a memory time hadn't managed to erase. Emma opened her arms, a silent invitation that Jack accepted, stepping into the embrace he had waited 2 long years for. "Forgive me," Emma whispered through her sobs. "I needed to become strong enough to be the mother you deserve." Sarah watched the scene, her own heart overflowing. Over the past weeks she had learned that love wasn't finite. The more you gave, the more you had to give. Jack had taught her that. "Sarah saved me," Jack said to his mother, still in her arms. "Just like I saved her. And now?" He pulled back slightly, looking between the 2 women who had changed his life. "Now I have 2 families." Emma looked at Sarah with endless gratitude. "Thank you for taking care of him," she said. "For giving him what I couldn't at that moment." Sarah stood joining them. "He's taught me more than I ever imagined," she replied. "About courage, forgiveness, and starting over." The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. In the nearby playground, children's laughter filled the air, carried by the gentle breeze. It was a sound of innocence, of possibilities, of futures yet to be written. "There's a cafe around the corner," Sarah suggested. They make the best hot chocolate in the city. Jack can confirm, we've had plenty of it together over the past few weeks. Emma smiled, wiping away her tears. I'd love that. As they walked together, Jack between the two women, their shadows merged on the ground as one. The boy who had once lived in the shadows now walked in the light, his hands holding onto the two people who had proven that love and courage could transform even the hardest stories into tales of hope. The city continued its rhythm around them, but now it seemed different, brighter, full of possibilities. A bottle of poison that was never used had turned into a door to redemption. A street boy had become an unlikely hero. And 3 wounded hearts had found healing in one another, proving that sometimes the strongest families are the ones we choose to build. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think about this emotional journey of courage, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Soul and History channel, so we can keep bringing you more stories that inspire and transform lives. See you in the next story.